During the outbreak of World War I in 1914, Adolf Hitler found a sense of purpose he had been searching for throughout his unsettled youth. After years of struggling as a failed artist and living in poverty, he suddenly discovered a cause larger than himself, something that gave him structure, identity, and a sense of belonging. When the war began, he volunteered to serve in the German army, joining the Bavarian Reserve Infantry Regiment 16, also known as the List Regiment. Unlike many young men who felt hesitation or fear about going to war, Hitler embraced it with enthusiasm. For him, the military was not just about fighting. It was about discipline, duty, and proving his loyalty to Germany, which he deeply admired despite not being born within its borders. As a soldier, Hitler quickly developed a reputation for being obedient and dutiful. He was not a commander or strategist, but he performed the tasks assigned to him with determination. Unlike many soldiers who tried to avoid dangerous assignments, Hitler volunteered for roles that placed him in harm's way. He worked as a regimental messenger, delivering orders and messages across the battlefield, often under heavy fire. This was one of the most perilous jobs in the army, because it required running across open fields or through trenches while enemy shells and bullets rained down. Many messengers did not survive long, but Hitler carried out his duties with a level of fearlessness that stood out to his superiors. The war itself was brutal beyond imagination. Soldiers faced constant bombardments, muddy trenches filled with disease, and the terrifying reality of chemical weapons. For 4 years, Hitler lived in this environment, enduring the same hardships as the men around him. He experienced hunger, cold winters without proper shelter, and the loss of countless comrades. Yet, he seemed to find strength in the regimented life of a soldier. For someone who had failed in civilian life, the army gave him a sense of order and purpose that he had lacked for so long. In 1916, during the Battle of the Somme, one of the bloodiest conflicts of the war, Hitler was wounded. A shell fragment hit him in the leg, and he had to be evacuated to a military hospital. This injury could have ended his service, but once he recovered, he requested to return to the front lines. Unlike many who would have chosen safety after such a near-death experience, Hitler's desire to serve remained strong. He returned to his regiment and continued his duties as a messenger, showing both stubbornness and determination. 2 years later, in 1918, he was temporarily blinded during a gas attack. Poison gas was one of the most feared weapons of the war, causing unbearable pain and permanent damage. Hitler was hospitalized again, this time in Pasewalk, where he slowly recovered. It was during this time, while he was still regaining his sight, that he received the news of Germany's surrender. For him, this was devastating. He could not accept that the nation he loved so deeply had been defeated. Like many others, he believed Germany had been betrayed rather than beaten, a belief that later became central to his political speeches. Throughout his military service, Hitler received recognition for his bravery. He was awarded the Iron Cross, Second Class, in 1914, and later the Iron Cross, First Class, in 1918, a decoration rarely given to someone of his rank, which was a corporal. This medal was usually awarded to officers, but Hitler's superiors acknowledged his consistent courage under fire. While he was never promoted to a high rank, the awards gave him pride and a sense of accomplishment. For a man who had struggled to find success in life, these decorations meant everything. Despite his bravery, Hitler did not form many close friendships in the army. Fellow soldiers described him as isolated, often keeping to himself when others laughed or shared stories. He was serious, avoided alcohol and women, and spent much of his free time reading or sketching. While others thought of the war as a temporary phase before returning to normal life, Hitler seemed to treat it as the central purpose of his existence. The army was the only place where he felt like he belonged, and losing that after the war left him searching for meaning again. The years in the trenches also shaped his worldview in deep and lasting ways. He saw the destruction of the war, the collapse of old empires, and the struggles of ordinary soldiers. He became convinced that strength and unity were the keys to survival, while weakness and division led to failure. These ideas later influenced his political vision for Germany, where he promised order, pride, and national revival. When the war ended in November 1918, Hitler was still in the hospital, recovering from his gas injury. The announcement of surrender and the abdication of the Kaiser left him furious and heartbroken. For him, the war had not just been a battlefield struggle, it had been a mission of honor. The loss felt like a personal betrayal, and this bitterness would remain with him for the rest of his life. The medals he wore proudly reminded him of his service, but they also fueled his resentment against those he believed had stabbed Germany in the back. Hitler's time in World War I was one of the most defining chapters of his life. He entered the war as a struggling, unknown man with no clear future, and he left it as someone with medals, experiences, and a burning sense of purpose. Although he was still far from becoming the leader of Germany, the war had planted the seeds of his future path. It gave him discipline, recognition, and a story of bravery that he could later use to gain followers. For many veterans, the end of the war meant returning to families, farms, or jobs, but for Hitler, there was no such place to go back to. The army had been his home, and without it, he felt adrift once more. This emptiness pushed him toward politics, where he sought to channel his anger, frustration, and ambition. What started as service to his regiment eventually became service to an ideology that would change history. After the end of World War I in 1918, Adolf Hitler found himself in a Germany that was broken, humiliated, and deeply divided. The country had surrendered, the Kaiser had abdicated, and the once mighty German Empire had been forced to sign the Treaty of Versailles. This treaty demanded enormous reparations, reduced Germany's military to a fraction of its former size, and stripped away territories that Germans believed rightfully belonged to them. For soldiers like Hitler, who had spent years in the trenches and believed they had fought bravely for their nation, this was more than just a political agreement. It felt like betrayal. The defeat cut him deeply, and like many veterans, he was angry, frustrated, and searching for answers. When he left the hospital after recovering from his temporary blindness caused by a gas attack, Hitler had no family to return to, no career to continue, and no clear path forward. The army had been his identity, and now even that was slipping away as the German military was forced to shrink. Yet fate placed him in a position that would slowly lead him toward politics. He remained connected to the army for a time, working in Munich. His superiors noticed his strong speaking ability and his intense nationalist passion, and they began assigning him tasks that involved political education. Hitler attended meetings, monitored political groups, and reported on their activities. It was in this role that he first encountered the German Workers' Party. The German Workers' Party was a small, obscure organization founded in 1919. It was not well known, and it certainly did not hold any real political power. At its core, the party promoted ideas of nationalism, anti-communism, and the belief that Germany had been betrayed by internal enemies during the war. Its meetings were small, often held in beer halls in Munich, where just a handful of men would gather to complain about the state of the nation. On September 12, 1919, Hitler attended one of these meetings as part of his army duties. At first, he was simply there to observe, but when a member of the group began speaking in a way that criticized nationalist ideals, Hitler could not stay silent. He stood up and delivered a passionate response, so powerful that the small crowd took notice. The party's founder, Anton Drexler, was impressed. He saw in Hitler a man who could energize audiences, a man who spoke with conviction and fire. Soon after, Drexler invited Hitler to join the party. At first, Hitler hesitated. He was not yet sure if politics was his path, but he was drawn to the passion of the group, and more importantly, he realized this small platform could give him the voice he had always wanted. Within just a few weeks, he accepted and became a member. He was given a membership card numbered 555, but in reality, the party numbered its cards to look larger than it was. In truth, Hitler was among the earliest members. From the beginning, Hitler stood out. He was not like most of the men in the party who enjoyed debating quietly over beer. Hitler brought intensity, energy, and above all, a talent for public speaking that the others lacked. He quickly rose through the ranks, not because of money or influence, but because his speeches had the power to captivate people. He spoke about Germany's suffering, the humiliation of the Versailles Treaty, and the betrayal he believed came from politicians and certain groups within society. His words resonated with audiences who were hungry for someone to explain their pain and give them hope. Recognizing the need to expand, Hitler began to shape the party's image. In 1920, the German Workers' Party changed its name to the National Socialist German Workers' Party, more commonly known as the Nazi Party. The new name was designed to appeal to both nationalists and workers, combining pride in Germany with promises of social reform. Hitler also helped design the party's emblem, the swastika within a white circle on a red background, a bold and striking symbol that would later become infamous worldwide. As the party grew, Hitler's role within it became undeniable. He organized larger rallies, drawing hundreds and eventually thousands of people. His fiery speeches turned anger into action, and his ability to channel the frustrations of the German people gave the party momentum. While other members had ideas, Hitler had charisma, and soon he was not just a member but the face of the movement. One reason for his success was timing. Germany in the early 1920s was in chaos. The economy was collapsing, inflation was destroying savings, and ordinary citizens were struggling to afford food and basic goods. The government, known as the Weimar Republic, seemed weak and incapable of solving the crisis. Political violence filled the streets as communists and nationalists clashed. In this climate, Hitler's speeches about strength, unity, and restoring Germany's honor found fertile ground. He promised to rebuild the nation, punish those he blamed for its defeat, and return pride to the people. For many who had lost faith in traditional politics, these promises were powerful. By 1921, Hitler's influence had grown so strong that he challenged Anton Drexler and other leaders for control of the party. He demanded that he be given absolute leadership, threatening to leave if his demands were not met. The party could not afford to lose its best speaker, so they agreed. Hitler officially became the leader, and from that moment, the Nazi Party was shaped by his vision. Hitler's joining of the German Workers' Party may have seemed like a small step at first, but it was the turning point of his life. Without it, he might have remained a forgotten veteran with no future. But with the party as his platform, he began to transform from an ordinary man into a political figure capable of influencing crowds and directing a movement. What began as a group of only a few dozen men in a Munich beer hall eventually grew into one of the most powerful political forces in history, all under Hitler's leadership. In those early years, however, it was still fragile. The party lacked money, organization, and recognition. Hitler poured his energy into speeches, propaganda, and the creation of a movement that relied on passion rather than resources. He was relentless in building it step by step, convinced that he was destined to lead Germany out of its misery. His journey from an anonymous soldier to a political leader began with that single meeting in 1919, when he first raised his voice in a beer hall and discovered the impact his words could have. The path from the German Workers' Party to the Nazi Party was more than just a change of name. It was the beginning of a transformation that would alter the course of history. For Hitler, it gave him the purpose he had been searching for since the end of the war. 7. Great Challenge. After Adolf Hitler took control of the Nazi Party, his next great challenge was to turn a small, fringe movement into a powerful political force. At first, the party was barely noticeable in Germany's political landscape. It had little money, no major newspapers supporting it, and no representation in government. What it did have, however, was Hitler's unique ability to speak directly to the emotions of ordinary Germans. He realized early on that speeches could be more powerful than policies written on paper. Words could move people to tears, fill them with pride, or ignite anger. He made his voice his greatest weapon, and it was through his speeches, combined with carefully crafted propaganda, that he rose to power. Germany in the 1920s was in turmoil, and this chaos provided fertile ground for his message. After the Treaty of Versailles, Germans felt humiliated. Many believed the reparations and military restrictions were unfair punishments. At the same time, the economy was crumbling. In 1923, hyperinflation destroyed savings overnight. Bread that once cost a single mark suddenly cost thousands, and families who had worked their entire lives lost everything. The middle class was especially devastated, and despair filled the air. Hitler tapped into this frustration, telling people what they wanted to hear, that Germany could rise again, that their suffering had a cause, and that he was the man who could fix it. His speeches were not delivered like those of traditional politicians. While others read from papers in dull, monotone voices, Hitler treated his speeches like performances. He began slowly, speaking softly to draw listeners in, then built up to fiery passion, raising his voice, using dramatic pauses, and gesturing with force. His eyes, intense and unblinking, gave the impression of absolute conviction. Crowds who came out of curiosity often found themselves swept away by his energy. Many Germans, tired of weakness in their leaders, were impressed by his confidence and determination. But speeches alone were not enough. Hitler and his followers understood the importance of propaganda, controlling the message, symbols, and images that reached the public. Under his leadership, the Nazi Party created striking visuals, such as the red banners with black swastikas, designed to be unforgettable. They published pamphlets, posters, and newspapers that spread their ideas. They also held rallies that were carefully staged, using music, flags, and dramatic lighting to make people feel like they were part of something larger than themselves. Propaganda turned politics into theater, and Hitler knew how to play the lead role. A key part of his rise was his ability to promise solutions without always explaining how they would be achieved. He spoke about rebuilding Germany's economy, restoring national pride, and creating jobs for the unemployed. For people suffering hunger and unemployment, these promises were powerful. Hitler also promised to protect Germany from communism, which many feared after seeing the Russian Revolution. By presenting himself as the only one strong enough to stop communism and rebuild the nation, he appealed to both workers and businessmen, uniting groups that were often divided. Even when the Nazi Party attempted a direct seizure of power with the failed beer hall putsch in 1923, which ended with Hitler's arrest, it ultimately worked in his favor. His trial became a national stage where he delivered speeches blaming the government for Germany's misery. Newspapers reported his words, spreading his message far beyond Munich. Though he was sentenced to prison, he used the time to write and plan, outlining his vision for Germany. When he was released, he returned with even more determination to rise through legal means rather than sudden violence. In the late 1920s, the Nazi Party remained small, but the Great Depression of 1929 changed everything. The global economic crisis hit Germany especially hard. Businesses closed, unemployment skyrocketed, and despair deepened. While other political parties argued and failed to provide solutions, Hitler presented himself as a man of action, someone who could restore order and prosperity. His speeches grew larger in scale, filling stadiums and town squares. He traveled across the country by airplane, something few politicians did at the time, allowing him to reach audiences quickly and appear modern, energetic, and unstoppable. The propaganda machine worked tirelessly to build his image. Posters showed him as a strong, fatherly figure who cared for ordinary workers and soldiers. Slogans were simple and memorable, promises of bread, work, and national revival. The Nazis also spread fear by blaming others for Germany's problems, particularly targeting minority groups and political opponents. This strategy created a sense of unity among supporters by giving them a common enemy. As his influence grew, Hitler attracted powerful allies. Business leaders who feared communism saw him as someone who could protect their interests. Nationalists who longed for a strong Germany admired his vision. Even ordinary citizens who had never cared about politics began to see him as a man who could bring stability. By the early 1930s, the Nazi Party had transformed from a fringe group into one of the largest parties in Germany. In the 1932 elections, Hitler ran for president against Paul von Hindenburg, a respected World War I general. Though Hitler lost, the campaign gave him national recognition. Millions voted for him, and he emerged as a political force that could not be ignored. The Nazi Party won significant seats in the Reichstag, Germany's parliament, making them one of the most powerful parties in the country. Despite losing the presidency, Hitler continued to gain ground. Political instability in Germany worked in his favor. The government was weak, unable to form stable coalitions or solve the economic crisis. Behind the scenes, conservative politicians and businessmen believed they could use Hitler's popularity to their advantage. They thought they could control him while benefiting from his mass support. They were wrong. In January 1933, under mounting pressure and political maneuvering, President Hindenburg appointed Adolf Hitler as Chancellor of Germany. What had once seemed impossible was now reality. Hitler, the failed art student and former soldier, had risen to the highest office in the land. He had not done it through wealth, noble birth, or long-standing connections, but through the sheer power of speeches, propaganda, and promises that spoke to the heart of a struggling nation. This rise was not simply about one man's ambition, it was about a country desperate for hope, order, and pride. Hitler gave them simple answers to complex problems, and his ability to package those answers in words, symbols, and grand promises allowed him to climb from obscurity to power. 8. as a chancellor. In January 1933, Adolf Hitler achieved what only a few years earlier would have seemed unthinkable. He was appointed Chancellor of Germany by President Paul von Hindenburg. For Hitler, this was the moment he had been striving toward ever since he first stood in a Munich beer hall and delivered a fiery speech to a handful of men. Yet his appointment did not come because he had seized power by force. Instead, it came through a mixture of political maneuvering, backroom deals, and the belief of conservative elites that they could control him. They thought Hitler's popularity with the masses could stabilize the country while they pulled the strings behind the scenes. What they underestimated was his determination, his cunning, and his refusal to ever play the role of a puppet. When Hitler became chancellor, his power was still limited on paper. He was only one man in a cabinet of many, and Hindenburg still held ultimate authority as president. But Hitler immediately set about changing that balance. He understood that political power was not only about legal authority but also about controlling the people's hearts and minds. His first months in office were marked by intense propaganda. Joseph Goebbels, his close ally and master of propaganda, flooded newspapers, radio, and posters with messages presenting Hitler as the savior of Germany. Public rallies and parades painted a picture of unity and strength, convincing many Germans that they were entering a new era of national revival. The turning point came just weeks after his appointment, on February 27, 1933, when the Reichstag, Germany's parliament building, went up in flames. The fire became a tool in Hitler's hands. Although the true cause was never definitively proven, the Nazis immediately blamed communists, claiming it was part of a plot to overthrow the government. Exploiting public fear, Hitler persuaded Hindenburg to sign the Reichstag fire decree, which suspended many civil liberties. Overnight, freedoms of speech, press, and assembly were curtailed. Political opponents, especially communists, were arrested by the thousands. It was the first step in transforming Germany into a state where opposition was silenced and fear replaced debate. In March 1933, Hitler pushed for even greater power. Through pressure, intimidation, and manipulation, he secured the passage of the Enabling Act. This law allowed the Chancellor and his cabinet to pass laws without the approval of Parliament or the President. In practice, it meant Hitler could rule by decree. With this act, the democratic framework of the Weimar Republic was effectively destroyed, and Hitler's dictatorship had begun. Once in control, Hitler wasted no time in reshaping Germany according to his vision. Political parties other than the Nazi Party were banned. Independent trade unions were dissolved and replaced with organizations controlled by the regime. State governments within Germany's regions were stripped of autonomy, ensuring that power was centralized in Berlin. By eliminating political pluralism, Hitler made sure there were no legal or institutional barriers to his authority. Propaganda intensified, portraying him not merely as a politician but as a leader chosen by destiny to restore Germany's greatness. His image appeared everywhere, on posters, in schools, in films, and in newspapers. He was presented as a man of the people, someone who had risen from poverty and hardship to lead the nation. For many Germans, weary from years of crisis and instability, this narrative was comforting. They saw in him strength and certainty. At the same time, Hitler built a regime based on fear and violence. The SS, Schutzstaffel, and the Gestapo, secret police, became instruments of terror. Anyone who criticized the government risked being arrested, beaten, or sent to concentration camps. These camps, which began as places for political prisoners, soon expanded into instruments of oppression against anyone the regime considered undesirable. Ordinary citizens learned quickly that silence was safer than resistance. The regime's brutality extended beyond politics. Hitler's ideology included a vision of society where only those he considered racially pure were valued. Laws were introduced to isolate Jewish citizens, removing them from professions, schools, and public life. These measures were justified through propaganda that spread hate and stereotypes. Though the full horrors of the Holocaust were yet to come, the foundations were being laid in the 1930s through systematic discrimination and dehumanization. Despite the cruelty of the regime, many Germans initially felt their lives improving. Hitler launched public works projects, such as the construction of highways known as the Autobahn. He expanded the military, creating jobs and restoring a sense of pride. Unemployment dropped dramatically, and propaganda showcased these successes as proof of Hitler's genius. To struggling families, it seemed as if he had delivered on his promises to rebuild Germany. This combination of tangible improvements and carefully controlled messaging blinded many to the growing oppression around them. By 1934, Hitler's position was nearly unchallenged, but there were still rivals within his own movement. The SA, a paramilitary wing of the party led by Ernst Röhm, had grown powerful and threatened to overshadow the regular army. Fearing Röhm's ambitions, Hitler ordered a purge in June 1934, known as the Night of the Long Knives. SA leaders and other political enemies were executed swiftly. The purge demonstrated Hitler's willingness to use violence against even his closest allies to secure his dominance. The army, relieved to see the SA weakened, pledged loyalty to him in return. Later that year, in August 1934, President Hindenburg died. Rather than hold new elections, Hitler merged the offices of President and Chancellor, declaring himself Führer, or leader, of Germany. The military swore an oath of personal loyalty not to the nation, but to Hitler himself. With that, his dictatorship was absolute. The democratic institutions of the Weimar Republic were gone, replaced by a totalitarian state where one man held complete power. Under his rule, Germany was transformed into a nation mobilized for war and shaped by ideology. Children were indoctrinated through groups like the Hitler Youth. Education, art, and even religion were aligned with Nazi values. Censorship silenced dissenting voices, while grand rallies and propaganda films created the illusion of unity and strength. Those who opposed or did not fit into the regime's vision faced persecution, imprisonment, or worse. Hitler's brutal regime was not built overnight, but step by step, using fear, propaganda, and the illusion of progress. By presenting himself as a savior, by crushing opposition with ruthless efficiency, and by offering simple solutions to complex problems, he had turned a fragile democracy into a dictatorship. The same man who had once been dismissed as an angry extremist now controlled the destiny of millions. For Germany, the price of his rise would soon become catastrophic, as the brutal policies at home expanded into aggressive actions abroad, leading the world into war.